News Center Maine is partnering with the Maine Monitor to bring you some of the reporting being done by journalists at the nonprofit independent publication, and we'll be featuring one of their stories each Monday. So today we are taking a closer look at schools in our state. Many communities will be voting on school budgets for next fall, but others, they're making a more difficult choice, weighing whether they should leave their districts entirely. So that's a process that's known as withdrawal, which allows towns to leave their school administrative units and seek alternative education pathways for their children. Here to talk more about the program is Christian Morvik, a reporter with the Maine Monitor. Great to see you again. Thanks for coming in to talk about this.
Nice to see you again, too.
This is a newer topic to me, so I'm very intrigued to see what you can share with us so far on this. Let's start with where we're starting to see some communities have this discussion on a withdrawal.
Yeah, so some recent examples that people might be familiar with happened in Strong and Phillips. Those are two towns up in Franklin County. They currently belong to the MSAD 58 school district. And they recently voted in May to start that process of leaving their school districts. So we'll get into what that entails maybe a little bit later, but my story actually focuses on a town that's in somewhat of a neighboring school district. They're part of the RSU 74. They're in Somerset County, very small town, and they've been a part of RSU 74 for over 50 years. And while they explored withdrawal about a decade ago, there's some renewed interest this spring to take a look at that. So they're actually going to be voting whether or not to start that process on June 10th, which is when everybody is looking at their school budgets.
That's when the big numbers come out. So you mentioned process. What does this process look like? I think from the outside it may seem a little intimidating of, okay, we're walking away from education, but what happens now with the students? So
it's a very, as you can imagine, a very complex process. It is set by Maine statute, and the Maine Department of Education actually has some materials that people can look at that kind of breaks down what a withdrawal procedure looks like. One document breaks it down into 22 steps, so it's pretty lengthy, yes. But essentially, you can kind of frame it by two votes. So the first vote that happens, which is what we saw in Strong and Phillips, is to initiate the process. And you have to petition to get it on the ballot, and if voters favor moving forward with that step, then the town can form a formal withdrawal committee. They might have some exploratory committees that are informal and have kind of looked at what it would look like to take that step, but they'll establish a formal committee. It's kind of overseen by the state, and they'll start negotiating with the school district to kind of figure out how to divide assets, make a plan for their students if a withdrawal were to happen. And that can be a very lengthy process. Of course, negotiations involve a lot of back and forth. They can take months. And during this process, towns are also doing some fact finding. They're retaining legal counsel. So it's a very involved process. Yeah. When all is said and done and they've reached a final withdrawal agreement, that's when the second vote can happen. And so that's when residents ultimately decide whether or not they want to stay or leave their school district. And depending on when they vote, because there has to be some cushion time for the school budget process to take place, which takes months.
Change. Yeah.
Exactly. But depending on when they vote, that withdrawal can take effect by the start of the next fiscal year.
Oh, which is actually pretty quick then. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's a lot of information that goes into this. There's a lot of data collection before voters weigh in on this. But what are some of the reasons that move a community in this direction to consider withdrawal?
So the reasons why a town might want to withdraw can vary. In Embden's case, those who are in favor of leaving see the rising cost of education, and that's a problem that a lot of communities are experiencing these days in Maine. But they see the rising costs of education at odds with the low number of students that they have in their school district. They see this as a burden on the taxpayer. So they think withdrawal could help ease that burden and potentially make it a little bit easier to live in their very tiny community. Obviously, not everyone agrees. There are residents in Embden who are very against this process and very against moving forward with these next steps that could be voted on in June. And they see it as something that could potentially harm the school district and harm the resources that are available to the students. I spoke with the RSU 74 superintendent, and he did make it pretty clear that some cuts would have to be considered if Embden were to ultimately leave. And also, this is just an issue that has drawn a lot of strong stances on both sides of the issue. A lot of debates happening in meetings, a lot of concerns being raised. One source even described it as one of the most controversial issues that has faced the town in a while. So it's not an easy process. The procedure itself is already complicated, but also the conversations happening as well are very complicated.
I think you're working on a lot of emotions anytime we're talking about our children, their education, therefore their future, and then to work in the kind of the tax impact on communities, a lot of elements to work in there. But helpful to hear that there is a very detailed process. Right. This isn't necessarily a rogue move that maybe a small group of people could do. A lot more to learn about this. So thank you for coming in to talk about us and piquing our interest on it. Christian, great to see you again.
Thank you.
You can read much more about this and everything the team is doing at the Maine Monitor anytime online at themainemonitor.org.